Let's continue with history, and we're trying to understand something that is the fundamental breaking point of all civilizations. No civilizations have ever mastered crossing this particular difficulty. The difficulty comes in such a way that it is unobservable to the mind, as long as the mind considers itself an individual self that has its roots in a cultural process. And said that way, it seems like a Zen koan then. How would you ever deal with something if you can't deal with it with a self-identifying individuality in your mind that comes integrally out of a cultural tradition? What else is there? And the short form answer is that there is consciousness. And that consciousness does not take place in the mind. It takes place in a visionary space that radiates out and rotates out from the mind. Vision is not at all the same thing as thought. Vision is a process of consciousness, whereas thought is a formal structure of symbols. Our minds are definitely an objective structure, which is why the objective structure of symbols can correlate directly with the objective structure of things in the world. And things in the world are established in their objectivity, not by being statically there, but by being existentially, iteratively there in a ritual comportment that is active. So that the things of the world, the existentials of the world, are ritual objectivities of action. And that's why the structure of the mind is cinched together integrally by thought. But when you look at thought from the basis of experience, because experience is a process, it tends to see everything in terms of its process. It sees the mind in terms of the process of thinking. So that the experience that your character has of the structure of your mind is the experience of thinking. But in the mind itself, thought is an objective structure that has a very definite form. In fact, it is the tightest integral form in the universe. And it is not just that we have a mind. Any kind of sentient life form that develops the ability to use symbols, symbolic language, a written symbolic language, will develop an objective mind, and their sentience in their life process will be indexed by their intelligence in their thought form, their symbolic structure. So tight and so precise is the mind's ability to structure itself integrally into a form that when it looks back for correlation, it looks back to ritual action in the world for confirmation and for cinching together. And what is cinched is in between it is that experience then is given a parenthetical limitation. And as you limit experience, as you limit any kind of a process, you get a condensation and an intensification. And so the mind will intensify experience by limiting its flow. And if the mind intensifies it too far, the flow will be too high powered and you will get a neurotic response. Or if you really squeeze it, you'll get a psychotic experience condition. So what happens is that the mind will utilize its identification correlations with ritual action in a pragmatic way so as to shape experience but not to stifle it, to give it a cohesion but not too much of a tension so that it becomes ill at ease. All of this is in the natural ecology. All of this is understandable in the simple, ordinary, as we would say, life. But what happens is that there are moments for almost everyone, and there are certain kinds of people who are special. And what they find is that the symbols in the mind from a moment of insight become like not formal structural walls, but become windows that one can look through. And one gets a glimpse, one gets an insight beyond this world, beyond the things in this world, beyond the structure of the mind. And what it does is it carries experience beyond, and you get a moment of, sometimes it's called an epiphany, or if it's a more gentle, dispersive way, a reverie. You'll get a daydream. Now, if thought begins to give itself over to daydreaming, you will not see this world. You will see the imagery of the daydream in your mind, which doesn't come from this world. Someone will call it fantasy or fantasization. It's really a very low energy form of vision. But when daydreaming is raised in its energy, and it's raised because the symbols are not just naturally, momentarily giving insights or reveries or daydreams, but in a more concerted way, really central major symbols become transparent and one can look through and see a completely new possibility of the world. A vision quest is a traditional way of taking yourself out of this ritual action world and putting yourself into a new confirmation. And the confirmation is to suspend your identity, suspend yourself momentarily, and let yourself go so that your experience now flows freely through the mind, through the transparent symbols, into a visionary space, a visionary realm. That visionary realm is as extensive as all of time and all of the dimensions of space, and so it qualifies as a fifth dimension. So that vision now becomes a five-dimensional realm where the universe is no longer the sole thing of everything, but one has now the possibilities. One of the little phrases that has been used from time to time is to call it, instead of a universe, now you have an omniverse. It can be many, many things. In Philadelphia at the Benjamin Franklin Institute of Science, they have several floors of exhibits, and one of them is an omniverse where you can see all sorts of different possibilities, like future history. They have a sample space station inside, about 37 feet in diameter, and you can play in this space station and see what it would be like to have a vision of literally being outside of the world and looking down on it, because from orbit you are no longer in the world that was our sole natural limit domain for as long as this species has existed, or even before. The last 4.6 billion years, this world has been the only environment, the only condition. And yet, the bacteria, who have been around for 3 of those billion years, do very well off-world. Human beings do very well off-world once they get used to it, once they get over a space sickness, once they get over a kind of a vertigo, once they get tuned to weightlessness. And it isn't just physiological weightlessness, but it is the mind understanding graphically that there is a conscious expansion, that the fifth dimension is not just another addition, but it is a transforming dimension that does not have unity as its defining boundary, but it has infinity as its resonant openness. So that now we can't call it a universe or an omniverse. We have to go back to an old Greek word, because it's the first time that any human beings had the conscious vision, and they called it a cosmos. And the person who did that first was Pythagoras. He said the cosmos has a structure which is based on resonance, and that the resonance has an unbounded infinity, and yet it has a harmonic that carries all the way through it, so that the extension of a harmonic is infinite, not an integral, but a differential. And so our learning is a recapitulation of everything that we have gone through as a species right up until this point of transformation. And this point of transformation is not a single transformation. It is not even across the board, everything. It is all the possibilities of everything. And so it is not just a 5-dimensional transform, but that 5th dimension opens into a whole new ecology of other dimensions. And we saw in the last phase, because we have shifted from subjects to phases. As long as you learn by subject, you stay within thought, within the limitations of the mind. The compartmentalizing by subject is a mental way of looking at everything, including oneself. But the phases are not subjects. The phases are much more primordial and therefore have a cosmic traction. And they're also an overview, and so they have a cosmic attraction as well. And so one opens up in 2 paired distinct ways. You realize that you can go back and recalibrate everything that you know, everything that you could know or could do, and that recalibration has a complementarity, a resonance, because as you recalibrate the past, you also recalibrate the future by opening up resonant sets within an expandable harmonic. Now your possibilities are not just an insight, but they're arrayed in sets of possibilities, and you can take a look not just with the creativity of a new kind of person, which does happen, but also with the further analytic of a scientific ability to look by experiment and see what kinds of ranges of possibility would you like to emphasize and what kinds would you like to stay away from. And so it becomes possible to have not only a 5-dimensional conscious space-time or a 6-dimensional art of the spirit person, but a 7-dimension historical conscious process. So history is a 7-dimensional flow. And out of it will come an 8-dimensional cosmos, a science of the infinite objectivity of the differential form. But history is where the problem is. Because the mind comes out of mythic culture, directly integrates out of it, develops its meaning out of it, takes the images of ritual comportment perception, sieved through the flow of the imagery and feeling and language of cultural mythic experience, and integrates and deepens that into the objective mind. And the mind trusts then that its form, its shape, is dependably the index, the accurate index of experience and the cultural traditional level. And it certainly is. And that it can prove that because it correlates to the ritual structures that are encouraging and sustain that culture, sustain that tradition. Generate those images. Take those emotions and refine them into feeling. Develop language so that one for the first time has the ability to speak, to have speech, oral speech, out of which comes an integral in the mind of the ability to have a written speech, a written language. And all of this is true. But as soon as you bring a transforming quintessential consciousness of vision into play, it opens up all the other transforms that now can come. And we saw that art is the first differential form. And it acts as if it were a prism, or if one would like to use spiritual language, the art of the person is to refine a multifaceted jewel of a personality instead of a centered individuality of a personality. In the mind, the personality will always be centered. It will be a structure that will have eventually a single pointedness. Now, this has been refined by thousands of years of prayer, of contemplation, of yoga. There are 20-lane highways of experience that one can go along, and you can confirm this for yourself. In Buddhism, that single point is called ekagrata, one-pointedness. In prayer, in Christianity, it's called the soul. In Judaism, it is called God, Yahweh. That single-pointedness, though, has a very curious ability. It can vanish and leave a complete openness. And when it comes back out of a complete openness, it doesn't reappear in its pointedness, but it reappears as a pivot, as a core, as a rotating, radiating core. So instead of just having a soul, now one has a soul core that is capable of generating a whole new realm, the realm of the conscious cosmos. And this is how this happens. But the vision of that is just the beginning out of which the art of the person and the works of art come creatively. But they generate a higher order of consciousness called historical consciousness. And it's out of that that science comes. But the difficulty is that when one tries to introduce history into the mind cannot handle it in the traditional way. Because history cannot be put into a cultural matrix. It won't fit. It's like vision will not fit in the normal world. It's extraordinary. Consciousness is extraordinary. A visionary experience, an epiphany, not to say a theophany, is extraordinary in the greatest. Those little moments of insight that you have, or those reveries that you are capable of. Those getting lost in thought, as someone says. No one ever gets lost in thought. One gets lost in the beginnings of consciousness, of seeing beyond. And there are people who, from birth, are able to see beyond. They used to be called the mystics, or the poets, or the holy people. When William Blake was 6 years old, he would tell his parents that he wanted to stay out a little longer and listen to the angels play their beautiful instruments in the trees in London. And later on, when he was in his 60s, almost 70, and did his Book of Job illustrations, the last thing that was there was the return back to spiritual reality, where all the people were playing the instruments that the angels used to play in the trees. Now human beings played those instruments together and joined the cosmos. But when history comes into play, unless you follow it in our phases, it is not discernible what has happened and why. But by using our phase learning, one can perform a critique on the basis of the person and an analytic on the basis of the scientific cosmos. And the analytic especially shows a devastating flaw and error. And that it has showed up increasingly over the last 2,500 years. And that it is the compounding of this flaw that destroyed Greco-Roman civilization, shattered it, so that it was put back together again in a pastiche, faux way, which was so devastating that it created what used to be called the Dark Ages. In his History of Western Philosophy, Bertrand Russell said that there was a period of 1,000 years in Western European thought that are a dull gray plane of such low-level mediocrity. In music, it's called a pianissimo. There's hardly any variation whatsoever. And he said there's only one little spire of a single genius, John Scotus Eriugena, around 800-something AD, and he created a brief flash in the time of Charlemagne and created the Carolingian Renaissance, which quickly was suffocated and died out, and the pianissimo went on for hundreds of years more. Why? Because all the capacity for vision was co-opted in a medieval variant of a very ancient way that culture and tradition used to have of protecting itself. The ancient way, before 2,500 years ago, was that only special circumstances and special people were allowed to have vision, like oracles. Yes, the oracle at Delphi can go into these visionary trance states, but not everyone she will do it. And the she is very neatly protected and insulated from everyone else, because usually the oracle at Delphi was just a young girl, hardly ever beyond early adolescence. And she was sat on a tripod seat over a deep cleft in the earth, where very peculiar fumes came up from very deep in the earth. And there at Delphi, there is a huge earthquake rift that comes down from Mount Parnassus and splits the earth in the major ravine where the Delphic oracle was. And she would sit on a tripod over that, and in those fumes she would come up, because she was not trained at all to have a symbolic mind. She would just speak in unconscious riddles, riddling language, which later other people would try to decipher. And this was a protective thing of ancient cultures, that vision was always something special, and it was never conscious, it was always unconscious. It was always a gift of the gods. It was always something strange, wondrous, unusual, but it was not anything that could be understood. Especially, it was not anything that could be understood that went beyond the mind's ability to protect the culture by keeping the index right, and that these were special little things. If you want to have a vision quest, you may not do it in the tribe. You may not do it here. You have to go out. You have to go into the unknown, into the wilderness. You have to go into the unconscious realms in order to have this. This was a protection. But 2,500 years ago, for the very first time, a questioning beyond culture became penetrating and poignant enough to poke a hole that could not be closed up. Traditional cultures like Egypt, or like Samaria, or like the Indus civilization, or ancient China, they knew how to enclose this and suture that up and keep this within the protective tradition and culture. But the classical urban Greeks of the 5th century BC had no such protection at all, because they had never faced someone like a Pythagoras who could not only poke his finger visionarily through, but he could carry it all the way through beyond vision into history that had a completely new quality to it. He said one of his famous sayings, and they limited Pythagoras' wisdom to little sayings, which was a way of keeping it like riddling, so that it would be like the Delphic oracle. You'd have to figure out what that was, but you wouldn't have a context big enough to really understand what it was. One of his sayings, the Greek word for his sayings was ipsa dixit, he said, meaning Pythagoras. He said, geometry is history, meaning there is a geometricity that is raised off the diagram in the symbolic mind that goes into resonances in the harmonic cosmos. And that's history. And that's what history is. It is a vast, infinite resonance of higher consciousness. It's consciousness juiced to cosmic level. And out of this, Pythagoras came with the understanding that it isn't a geometry of lines and planes on a diagram, it is the geometry of the experience of hearing raised into the resonance of octaves that develop musical harmony. And so Pythagorean music was a way of taking geometry off the page and putting it into the air, putting it into the sphere. And not just the sphere of the air, but all the stars all the planets, are also spheres that sing together. They have a harmonic. The whole heavens has a harmonic. And so it isn't astrology, which is the geometry of shapes against a plane in the mind, but it is the celestial harmonics of the music of the spheres. It's a completely different, a completely transformed thing, and it generated something extraordinary. It gave a whole new ecology that complemented the ecology of nature. And whereas nature went through ritual, myth, and symbol to cinch itself integrally on this world, on worlds, the other ecology was vision, art, history, and science, which doesn't cinch at all, but which continues to open up. And so it's a differential ecology, not an integral ecology. And the difficulty was that when this was first worked out 2,500 years ago, it was almost impossible to find a way for both those cycles to work together. Because every time you tried to work them together, the protean transformable quality of the conscious ecology would so swirl the natural ecology that it was no longer workable. But the first attempt to do that produced a complete breakdown. And the breakdown had to be one place or the other. It had to be in the mythic culture, or it had to be in the conscious history. And it was in the conscious history. And the record of that is in Thucydides. That's why we're taking these books, not just to be in school, to read texts, get educated, great books. It's because this is the evidence. This is where it was. And it's still germane. He says, at the very beginning, I, Thucydides of Athens, prepared a written account of the war that was fought between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians. I began writing as soon as the war broke out, in the belief that it would be more important and more interesting than any war that had gone before it. I reached this conclusion because both sides were at the highest state of readiness in every way, and because I saw the whole Greek world joining one side or the other, some immediately, some planning to do so eventually, that this was the greatest ferment ever to sweep the Greeks and many of the barbarians, in other words, the majority of the human race. And he says, having done this, he was shattered to realize that this condition would repeat itself again and again until the transform was shifted out of the cultural, traditional mythos into the conscious history, allowing for an analytic objectivity to be not only emerged and born, but to be refined enough through experience with it, practice with it, so that one could use a historical analysis of the entire double ecology enough to make it work, to let it come to its own maturity, and this has not happened. And the difficulty was that there was a cycle to this, that it didn't just happen again and again, every year or every decade or every century, but it seemed to happen every 500 years. And Tacitus comes 500 years after Thucydides, and he is bowled over. He's astounded that the Roman world, which was a completely different, though it was related to the Greek world, it was related, the Romans were related to the Greek world like the Christians were related to the Jewish world. Yes, there were cognate developments, but they went way beyond, in fact, became almost antithetically different. Tacitus says we have, in our time, found ourselves in this same situation again, only In Thucydides, it was all of Greece. Now, because the Roman Empire controls most of the known world, it involves the whole world. So that the problem has become exacerbated. And that it isn't just that there are greedy, mean people trying to keep control, like in Thucydides' day, but now the people trying to keep control are absolutely horrendously, nightmarishly insane. And that this is an intolerable situation. No one can live with this. Where will this go? And even if we found a way to survive this, the next time such a cycle comes up will be devastating beyond belief. One of the ways to mitigate that was 200 years after Tacitus, the Roman Empire shifted its whole perspective and said, we're going to get out of what got us in here, because what got us in here was taking the Greek gods. So what we're going to do is we're going to take something that is completely antithetical to the Greek gods. We're going to make a Roman Empire based on Christianity, on our kind of Christianity, so that we will not have a repeat of that cycle. And within 100 years of that decision, the Roman Empire was gone. The fall of the Roman Empire, about 100 years after that. And the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages came in. And for about 1,000 years, you didn't get the old, archaic self-protection limitations. What you got was the medieval variant, which is the introduction of superstition as a quality of keeping a haze on vision. So that now, instead of having moments of vision, you have moments of superstition. And so the medieval sense of a further dimension is that the otherworldliness is full of angels and demons, and superstitiously one has to really watch out for that. One has to propitiate or one has to protect, but there isn't anything you can do about it. These are realms beyond our control. And so the medieval variant is a regression back into a superstitious mythos. It isn't just natural mythology now, based on ritual and indexed by symbols. So that one cannot trust one's mind to index such a world, one now has to put one's confidence into doctrines, into ideologies. And one has to have these doctrinal beliefs. And only by following them in one's rituals, and only by believing them in one's experience, and only by confirming them in one's mind, will you be able to deal then with this wild, superstitious dimension to life and to the world. It took 1,500 years after Tacitus for someone to realize that you have to go back to the original. You can't do it by going back to the 1st century AD. You have to go back all the way to the 5th century BC. And that's what the Italian Renaissance in Florence especially was based on. Let's go back to the original Greek experience of this. What did they do? And was there another alternative to the Roman Empire that came out of that? And if so, it must be a secret tradition. Let's find out what that secret tradition is. And they found that the Pythagorean tradition was transformed and went into Plato's dialogues. And so right away, they realized the whole medieval ethos was based on Aristotle and Roman transforms of it. Let's let that go momentarily. Let's go back to Plato. And when they went back to Plato, they found that there was a secret tradition all this time, preserved in the Byzantine Empire. And that they knew that it wasn't just the Platonic tradition, but that 500 years after Plato, it came into a real transform called the Hermetic writings. And so the richest man in Italy at that time, Cosimo de' Medici, his family owned banks, got the only remaining copy of the Hermetica and immediately had his translator translate it before he died. And that was called the Renaissance. Let's take a break. Let's come back to this very interesting development. It has only been 500 years since the Renaissance, which means that our time, in terms of the traditional cycling of history, is back at the crucial point again. But it is not a crucial point. It is a threshold. And the threshold is not a boundary of an integral. It is also not discernible by the mind without a conscious visioning dimension added to it. And so for persons who are corralled into traditional structures, indexed by limited mentalities, have no way of knowing whatsoever, not only of the promises, but of the perils. And so those few, amounting to a trace element of humanity, who still have the capacity for insight, for visioning, for epiphanies, for bringing their maturation through into that jewel-like spiritual form of the art of the person, who then really do generate historical consciousness in that high energy flow. There is no way for them to alert about 98% of the human population, because the traditional response is, that's not true, or that's not new. Whereas it is true, and it is once again completely new. And at the scale, in the early 21st century, is off the graph. There is no way that one can graph the complications that are there, and there is no way piecemeal to address them. If you tried to even learn in traditional ways of how to address problems, you wouldn't live long enough to get out of kindergarten, vis-a-vis the complications that are really there. So it is an impossible path, and one to be let be suspended. It turns out to be superfluous anyway. It's extraneous. The traditional limitations of maturation and of minds are actually extraneous to the reality of both the promise and the peril. So the only way to do it is to go back and recognize that when it first surfaced about 2,500 years ago as a do or die, make or break issue, and that, just to reiterate what we talked about before the break this morning, the do or die, make or break notion that came into play in the 5th century Greeks was that they had no long cultural tradition to limit the crisis. Whereas all the traditional long-term civilizations like the Egyptians or the Sumerians, the Chinese, the Iranians, all had thousands of years of experience of how to limit these things and let moments of epiphany or vision be put into special people or special situations. If you wanted to do a divination in the ancient world, it was split into two functions. One were the people who did the auguring. They were called augurs. And in every language had its own word that meant the same thing. Those who observe the flight of birds, who observe the liver, who observe the cracks in the tortoise shell, they were the augurs, but they did not interpret. The interpreters were a completely different thing. The augurs were the visionary, momentarily visionary, approved by the culture. They could see into patterns and then deliver what they saw, but the interpreters were the priesthoods that protected those cultures, those traditions, and kept them whole so that the visions would not split them apart, that the insights would not be cracks in the structure. But the classical Greeks, in the 5th century BC, because of Pythagoras, had gone beyond the limitations of augurs and interpreters. That's only viable as long as you stay in a symbolic form, and the vision is just momentarily for a few people. If you carry the visionary dimension, that quintessential conscious dimension, into its natural, supernatural solution, where it becomes saturated, when consciousness becomes saturated, it does what every process in reality will do. It will allow for an emergence of a form to come out of it. And whereas existential things come out of nature, and symbolic thought comes out of experience, what comes out of supersaturated consciousness is the spiritual person, who comes out as a spirit crystal. Not at all just a form like iron, but comes out like a jewel, comes out like a crystal. And one of the distinguishing qualities of a crystal, the same as of a work of art, the same as of a spiritual person, a crystal will have a multifaceted quality, so that the approach to it will have a facet kinetics, that you have to do a fast, free-flowing, infinite, unbounded gestalt spontaneously to be able to even flow with it, so that art forms and spirit forms and differential conscious person forms are like living crystals. And their facet kinetics, this presentation today, its title is Differential Person Facet Kinetics. This has a whole different approach. In the presentation notes for history, you'll find under History 3, page 2, a little illustration from the latest issue of Nature, the International Journal of Science. It's been out for over 100 years. This is the way that neurons, brain cells, work. They do not work integrally, each one doing its little thing and then having to communicate that, but they flow, instead of together, they flow differentially, radiating out with a chirality, so that there's a rotational angular momentum to them, so that the interrelations of neural energy in the neuron networks curls in all of these interesting ways, so that they work together all the time, each modifying each other all the time. It's like adaptive optics. And it turns out that thought, when it gets juiced by consciousness, its adaptive optics become infinitely adaptive. There's no bounded limit to spiritual intelligence at all. And it can be shown neuronically now. This is a learning to generate a population of people who can teach the rest, so that one weans oneself away from the subject mentality that crushed all the civilizations before us, because it will do no good to make a new civilization on the basis of the old ones at the time speed that's going on now. It wouldn't last even 3 generations. It would fracture again. And fracture in the old ways. It would turn into an empire that bases itself on ceaseless war. And if it didn't finally wink itself out, including all life, it would simply create a nightmare, junkyard mess. It is already a perilous world, but it would be a nightmare landscape. What is important for us is that by going back to begin our phase of history, to remind ourselves, we're not going back to textbooks. We're not going back just to Thucydides and Tacitus because they're famous histories back then. This is a way to get us into the differential neuronal patterns of a higher consciousness that will really work. And we will see towards the end of history, one of the most brilliant of all the people of the 20th century was a woman named Hannah Arendt. And she was extraordinarily brilliant. One reason was her native intelligence, but another was that her first serious love affair for years was with the most powerful, sophisticated philosopher in Europe. She was his student, and she fell in love with him, and he literally force-fed her the brilliance of his peak of his career. And as a young woman, she simply got not only the best education you could have gotten because of him, but because as an anecdote to him, she struck up a friendship with the other most famous philosopher of the 20th century. The first one was Martin Heidegger, and the other one was Karl Jaspers. And Heidegger turned out to be the spokesperson for the Nazi Party. And she was Jewish. And so it broke off a great deal for her all of a sudden in the midst of her maturity as a young woman, and the person that helped her gain perspective all the way through was her lifelong friendship with Karl Jaspers. Their letters are about 800 pages. And he's the one who was the most poignant critique of existential phenomenology, of which Heidegger was the star philosopher, the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, many say. But it is Heidegger's historical conscious critique of that is one of the most unknown and yet most profound qualities of 20th century philosophy. But it's very difficult to approach such things because they are protected from being understood because of academic corrals that make it like picket fences or barbed wire fences, that you have to have PhDs and 100 years of research to be able to even get in to begin to understand, and no one can live long enough now to be able to do that pattern. It's unnecessary. Because by using our technique of not just taking books, what we are doing is we are pairing things so that they lose their mental boundedness as texts. Because texts are only good to inculcate subjects. We're not learning subjects. We're not interested in subjects. We're not interested in becoming subjective all over again in the same flawed ways. Not only do we not need it, no one needs it. It's necessary for us then to see that learning must shift its posture away from subjects, away from grades of school, by subjects, by exams, by texts and tests, that entire entourage is flawed permanently. It's radioactive, as a matter of fact. Anyone who goes back to that turns out to become a radioactive zombie, as one would say, of that old flawed way. Our learning goes by phases which completely obviate the text, the test, the subject, and the inculcation all at once, because it's completely new. And because it's differential, it has its own differential ecology, and because this learning is a complementarity of the two ecologies, nature and consciousness, finally not fit together, but put into a dynamic, creative complementarity so that it will eventually refine itself indefinitely. One of the things about this is that once you learn to learn this way, you can learn to learn indefinitely better and better and better. And it's not based on the text. It's not based on the subject. It's not your ability to pass tests. All of that is irrelevant. It is a development of at least an 8-dimensional capacity, which not only self-adapts and self-corrects, but it is communicable in a sense that is shareable. That people who do this together or at different times have an increased expanded ability because they are no longer limited by boundedness and by definitionness, and are not out to convince each other or to persuade each other or to argue with each other. All of that is actually extraneous. It would be, to someone differentially conscious, it would be like tuning into a 50s game show. It'd be nice to watch 5 seconds of it. Oh yeah, that's what it was. So long. We don't need $64,000 questions. It is a complete, not revolution, that would be the wrong word. That would be a mental habit word. It is a recalibration. And a recalibration is infinitely stronger than a revolution. The difficulty is that when we come to history like this, if you're working with phases, we need to realize that a frame of reference, a square of attention, always will have 4 phases to it. But as you add conscious phases to what was the natural frame of reference, the frame of reference no longer remains a square of attention, but the more conscious phases that you bring into play, the more pliable it becomes in terms of possibility. And the threshold of equilibrium between the differential and the integral is when art comes into play. Because when you have the 4 phases of myth, symbol, vision, art, 2 of them are integral and 2 of them are differential. And so art has this interesting interface where it is central to reality. The art of the spiritual person is the central pivot upon which reality is able to generate itself, not just in the universe or omniverse, but in the cosmos. And it isn't just our kind of spiritual person. Any being in any star system that achieves the ability to bring the art of a differentially jeweled person out of conscious visioning, balanced with the symbolic mind as a form coming out of an enriched experience mythos will have that capacity. But when history comes into play, it's the third phase in the conscious evolution. What it does is it displaces out of the square of attention myth. So the mythic process gets replaced by the historical conscious process. And now you have a square of attention that is only 1/4 integral, the symbolic mind, and 3/4 of it is differentially. Two of them very powerful processes, vision and history, and the other a very powerful form, the spiritual person. So now the mind is not only outnumbered, but it is out-transformed 3 orders beyond myth. That culture has been raised 3 whole orders beyond the kind of experience that would just come out of ritual and be indexable by an integral mind. Now the mind gets astounded at what it can know and what it can think about. And that it can think about itself in ways that it was never able to think about before. Because when you are at art, you have the ability, as a spiritual person, to not just have an individuality, but to have the ability to make your portrait, your self-portrait, or a portrait of another being. The portrait of a tree, the portrait of a favorite animal, portrait of another person. But when the historical consciousness comes into play as an even higher order, you have the ability to have that portraiture modulated through the entire history of the life of the person. Here's a portrait of Einstein as a young boy. Here's a portrait of Einstein at the patent office. Here's Einstein, the internationally famous mathematician in Germany. Here's Einstein as an old man pacing the campus of Princeton in a floppy sweatshirt and frizzy white hair, thinking about the incredible reality that the cosmos really not only is, but is presenting all the time, and he's feeling the resonances. Because he is a resonant, jeweled set with the cosmos, understands it not only perfectly well, but participates in it in reality. Quantum mechanics, developed by Niels Bohr, for the first time showed that the dimension of observation changes the way that space-time works, because space-time that had a limited set of options before, because of ritual existence and because of bounded mentality, now an observer who participates with it changes the way in which time-space or space-time actually works, because it introduces a differential range of infinite possibilities into the actuality of it. The difficulty is that it was too often phrased as the observer affects the experiment. It isn't that at all. That's a mental bad habit way of talking about. It's that conscious observation adds a dimension to space-time itself. And when the artistic person comes into play, you have a 6th dimension. And when history as a dynamic process of higher consciousness come into play, you have a 7-dimensional process now, and it's like a super flow. Vision already is an unbelievable flow, but when historical consciousness flows really as a process, it is staggering and stunning. It's unbelievable. And our 2 first examples showed that the impact of that wave front crushed classical Greece, and then it crushed classical Rome. But whereas the classical Greeks were trying to find a way that people could work in a new form, a new political form, they called it democracy. Thucydides and Plato, Sophocles, Socrates, all of the classical Greeks that were living at the time of Thucydides all worked with this problem. How do we make it possible for there to be a population of people, a democracy that could be a political form that could handle this new energy? And what happened was that it was always continuously, inevitably co-opted because it was based on politics, on political forms, which maintain their symbolic structure through a commandeering of ritual power, limited experience, on the basis of a doctrine index. So here's our political party with its platform, and if people will do such and so, then we will, between that, we will sandwich in the experience, and it will be predictable in terms of what we want to happen. And if we do this with the majority of the people, instead of by some king or some priestly faction, then we'll have a new form of government. It didn't work. It doesn't work as long as it's lodged in the symbolic mind, because it follows into a reductive drain hole every single time. But by Tacitus's time, it was so apparent that it doesn't just produce uncomfortable tyrannies by really bad people. Now, 500 years later, when Rome had taken over most of the known world, it produced really nightmarish, unbelievable stuff. And the first person that it came up in was the second emperor of the Roman Empire, Tiberius Caesar. It was the first time it came up. And it came up so gross and gruesomely that it produced, Tacitus calls the chapter the Reign of Terror. He uses an example of Tiberius, who had his grandson put into a closed prison and then beaten and smashed and hounded. And finally, even when Drusus Caesar was dead, Tiberius attacked him. The charges included immorality, plots to murder his relatives, designs against the government. He also ordered reports of the prince's daily doings and sayings to be posthumously recited. This seemed the supreme cruelty. That agents had stood by Drusus all these years, noting every look and groan, even private mutterings, and that his grandfather could have heard, read, and published the whole story was scarcely credible, yet there were the reports of staff officers, the guard, an ex-slave named Atticus and Didymus, respectively, and in them the names of the slaves who had struck and intimidated Drusus Caesar whenever he tried to leave his room. The officer even noted his own brutal language as something creditable. He also recorded the dying man's words, first feigning madness. Drusus Caesar had screamed, apparently delirious, maledictions upon Tiberius, his grandfather. Then, despairing of his life, he had uttered an elaborate and formal curse that for deluging his family in blood, for massacring his daughter-in-law, nephew, and grandchildren, Tiberius might pay the penalty due to his house, to his ancestors and his descendants. The senators interrupted as though horrified. What really horrified them and amazed them was that one so formerly astute, so secretive a concealer of his crimes as Tiberius should unflinchingly snatch away the prison walls and show his grandson battered by an officer, beaten by slaves, vainly begging the very bare necessities of life. And Tiberius went downhill from there. This is in Tacitus's Annals of Imperial Rome in 34 AD. That's exactly in this year, in this condition, that Jesus left Egypt and went back to Palestine to challenge the Roman world. And did so in a long historical cycle that was familiar to everyone who understood the ancient Semitic tradition. The ancient Semitic tradition was that not everyone was literate, so they could not read, but everyone had ears to hear, so let those who have ears to hear, hear. And what that meant was that you went every Sabbath, and what you heard was not a sermon, not somebody preaching at you, but you heard someone recite the Torah, and because the Torah was so long, it took 3 years of Sabbaths to recite the whole thing, so that you would have heard God's law yourself, not interpreted, no commentaries, but read out loud to you, told you. And so Jesus taught for 3 years. This is called the lectionary cycle, to say this is a new Torah. This is a transform. That Torah was important then. This transform is essential and necessary now, because the world has come to a complete crisis. And in Tacitus, in the Annals, a little bit later, is the first time that anyone wrote of the 500-year cycle of the Phoenix. And Tacitus, a very careful historian, says there is no doubt that this bird really exists. The eyewitnesses are exact. It always comes out of Arabia. And it always comes to take the dead father back to the fire, the flames, and out of the ashes there will come something that will transform the new Phoenix so it's able to have a 500-year lifetime in existence. It is only from the ashes of the fire, it's an alchemy. It's only by a spiritual alchemy that life renews itself in the cycles of the Phoenix every 500 years. But you don't just find this as like cycles of the Phoenix. One understands that this ancient historical cycling had its ability to have arrangements, and so there were 2 cycles of the Phoenix, 2 500 years that would make 1,000 years, make a millennium. And then because of the ancient wisdom that you don't just pair something, but that pairs pair, so that there are 4 cycles of the Phoenix that make 4 500 years, make a 2,000-year double millennium. That's called an aeon. And that the aeon is the pace by which civilizations would live in a natural-based ecology. But in a supercharged ecology as we are in, every generation is like a cycle of the Phoenix. If we continue to not learn, we have about 3 generations left. That's it. Because there's no recourse except to learn how to do it differently and then live indefinitely. It is a serious problem when one comes to history, and as long as Augustus Caesar was alive, the Roman Empire had its, not just its ability to be contained, but Augustus had some of the smartest people on the planet at the time, and so he had these steam valves that could blow off and release enough pressure so that it didn't explode or implode. Can do either way. In Tiberius, it imploded. And not only just Tiberius, the next Caesar, Gaius Caesar, was so monstrously crazy that they murdered him after only 4 years. And the next Caesar, they were very careful to make sure that they edged into office somebody who was impaired, Claudius, with a lisp, who was dominated by several very strong women who could be approached with bribes and power and everything. And they thought Claudius would be very easily handled. And then finally, when he began to really get the gist of being the emperor, they got rid of him and they brought in Nero. And Nero was so crazy that he literally burnt Rome down because he wanted everything new, because he was suspicious of everyone and everything. Everyone is out to get me. I am a god. I can do what I want. They don't understand this. Well, they'll have to go, not me. But he went. And with him, the whole Caesar lineage went. And Tacitus in the Annals chronicles from the death of Augustus to a year between 68 and 69 AD, when the office of the Roman emperor was so radioactivity, there were 4 emperors in 1 year, each one worse than the next. Until finally they scrapped not only the Caesar line, but they asked for someone powerful to go and get a new vision to redo the empire under another dynasty. And that person is covered in Tacitus' follow-up to the Annals, the Histories, that goes from the death of Nero and the 4 emperors in 1 year to the founding by Vespasian of the Flavian dynasty. And it lasted exactly 3 emperors, each one worse than the next. And the last one, Domitian, his whole reign was called a reign of terror. Absolutely criminally insane. He was finally murdered and disposed of, and a very old man, almost in his 90s, was brought in for a couple of years named Nerva, and Nerva made sure that he brought in somebody who was very Romanly, traditionally, plainly, honest, and powerful, Trajan, and Trajan discovered that for him, he could rule as long as he never went to Rome. That there was something radioactively haunting in Rome. And so he would stay on the outer rims of the empire, and he expanded the Roman Empire to its largest extent. And he advised his adopted son, Hadrian, just travel. Rule and just travel. Don't go to Rome. It is poisoned by something that is spiritually haunting. We don't know what it is, but it has crumbled into nightmare. All of these powerful forebears of ours, and no one has had the ability to have any kind of peace in the world since Augustus Caesar died in 14 AD. What's peculiar is that when he established the moment of historical peace, he built in Rome a temple called the Temple of Eternal Peace of Augustus, the Ara Pacis Augusti. It was built at the entrance to Rome of the Via Flaminia that was coming from the powerful New North. The Appian Way goes to the south, and the Via Flaminia goes to the north, the new powerful part of the Roman Empire. And right at that Flaminian gate, he built the Ara Pacis Augusti in 9 BC, the year that Jesus was born. When Augustus died, he had literally ruled, either in part or in person, for 57 years, so that no one alive could hardly remember anyone else. And if you did remember anyone else, you remembered an even more powerful person before Augustus Caesar, his uncle Julius Caesar. So the Caesars had literally dominated the Roman Empire in this very powerful genius mode for almost 4 generations. And when Tiberius came in, he was not a son of Augustus, he was the son of Augustus' second wife, Livia. And the sons that Augustus had with Livia died beforehand, leaving Tiberius by himself with another who very quickly was disposed of when Augustus was dead. And so when Tiberius took over, he literally imploded into this madness. The person that mirrored his implosion and madness was Herod the Great in Palestine. Herod the Great, who had been made king by Mark Antony in 40 BC, completely imploded as well, only he did it 2 generations before Tiberius, so Tiberius literally repeated the history of the madness of Herod the Great. Herod the Great, when he died in 4 BC, was so disgusting, not only morally and spiritually, but physically. He was literally eaten from the inside out by maggots. It was only then that Joseph could bring Jesus and his mother back from Egypt, because Herod was obsessed by killing the spiritual person who would grow up to end this kind of rule forever. It's the same thing that grabbed Tiberius and led him into this kind of a madness. And it's the same thing that grabbed the new Flavian dynasty, because it was Vespasian and his oldest son Titus who destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and took the power of it to Rome, or continued to add to the radioactivity. More next week.